Monica and George have been married for 2 years, and all of their friends and acquaintances see them as the perfect couple. They met accidentally, and at the time, neither of them suspected that it would lead to anything more than just a friendship. George had a job as a manager at a trading company and dreamed of getting promoted. However, things were a bit different for Monica. She wasn't very ambitious regarding her career and mostly wanted to start a family. Since Monica grew up in an orphanage, she was deprived of parental warmth and affection from an early age. Therefore, when George started courting her, her joy knew no bounds. Finally, a worthy man had appeared in her life, she thought. What made Monica even happier was the fact that George's mother accepted her as her own daughter from the moment they met. Charlotte White, George's mother, had raised her son alone after her husband died in a car accident over 20 years ago. She surrounded her beloved son with care and attention, doing everything she could to ensure that he had everything he needed and received a good education that would serve him well in the future. When Monica came to George's place, she was anxious about how she would be received by his family. She was frightened by the stories her friends had told her about their terrible relationships with their mothers-in-law and was truly afraid of Mrs. White. But when Monica finally met George's mother, all of her fears evaporated like morning mist on a warm June day. "Hello, honey. You're exactly how I imagined you. You know, you even look a little like my late mother," Mrs. White said from the doorway. Monica immediately felt relieved and couldn't help but smile. Mrs. White was such a kind person. Monica felt an inexplicable surge of strength and energy. Mrs. White cooked a delicious dinner to celebrate the introduction, pleasantly surprising the guests with the abundance of dishes and their amazing taste. When George and Monica announced that they were planning to get married, the woman's joy knew no bounds. "Finally, I'm so happy, dear." Frankly speaking, Charlotte liked Monica at first sight and immediately knew that she would grow to love her. "How did I get so lucky to have such an amazing daughter-in-law?" Mrs. White kept repeating. The most surprising thing was that after the wedding, the relationship between Charlotte and her daughter-in-law didn't get any worse. On the contrary, they became even closer. Seeing a kindred spirit in Monica, Charlotte began teaching her all the little tricks that could help with cooking and household chores. When making a pie, don't ever compromise on the quality of the dough. It should be well mixed and free of lumps, Charlotte said, whose baking skills were truly incredible. "But thank you, Mrs. White. I don't know what I would do without you," Monica said, feeling very happy with all the attention she received from her mother-in-law, who treated her not only with love, but with respect. Meanwhile, George couldn't be happier with the fact that his wife and mother were getting along so well. Since George directed all of his energy to work, he had no time to deal with potential family squabbles. 6 months after the wedding, Monica found out that she was pregnant. "That's incredible news. Wonderful, just wonderful. I'm sure it's a boy. Someone will inherit the business," George exclaimed, struggling to contain his excitement. Monica bit her lip, then said cautiously, "Why are you so sure it's a boy?" "There's a 50% chance it could be a girl. It's not like we get to choose." George raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What do you mean, a girl?" No, girls. I need an heir. I need a son to take over the business when he grows up," he replied. "Don't be so overly dramatic, son. What difference does it make if it's a boy or a girl, as long as the baby's healthy?" Mrs. White tried to defuse the situation, but there was no changing George's mind. He was firmly convinced that he only wanted a son and would never be happy with a daughter. George believed that he would succeed in business and would be managing his own firm in the next 5 to 7 years. In his mind, he envisioned teaching his son how to do business and taking him to the office to introduce him to his colleagues. He imagined how they would all look at him admiringly. To calm her husband down a little, Monica told him that they needed to wait 3 months before they could learn the baby's sex. "Well, I don't mind, but I know it's a boy. George White is having a son, period," the man summed up. Monica exchanged a meaningful look with her mother-in-law, but declined to comment. George always had a bad temper, so she tried not to get into confrontations with him. 3 months flew by, and during this time, not a single day passed without George insisting that he was 100% sure they were having a son. But when the sonographer performed the ultrasound, it turned out that the young parents were actually having a baby girl. "I don't believe it. It has to be a mistake. Everyone in my family always had sons," George exclaimed in response. The doctors simply shrugged their shoulders and explained that genetics could be unpredictable, and even the most reliable theories could fail. After the ultrasound, George seemed to have been replaced. He immediately became cold towards his wife, as if Monica was to blame for the fact that they were having a daughter. But that wasn't the only thing that upset the expectant mother, who had to deal with such a strange reaction from her husband to the fact that she couldn't somehow ensure that she would have a boy. Charlotte Whitehead started complaining of chest pains, which only got worse as time passed. The woman was refusing to get treatment, as many elderly people do. Mrs. White strongly disliked hospitals and doctors, although she respected and appreciated them. "Nevertheless, you can't behave like that. You need to take care of your health. Everything else can wait," Monica said, trying to reason with her mother-in-law. "I can't deal with that right now. Let's wait until you give birth. And then we can revisit this issue. I'll be fine. Don't worry about it. I'll make myself a cup of herbal tea, and I'll be feeling better in no time. Trust me, I've done it before," Mrs. White said. Unfortunately, the woman didn't get better. In fact, she got much worse. By that point, Monica was nearing her due date and couldn't devote much time to her mother-in-law. George seemed to be avoiding home altogether, spending more and more time at work. It just so happened that Mrs. White had a heart attack in the backyard while she was about to water the flowers and treat the trees with an aphid solution. Monica was the one who found the elderly woman. She knelt down by her mother-in-law and took her hand. Charlotte's pulse was barely palpable, which made Monica realize how serious the situation was, and she immediately called an ambulance. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of the resuscitation team, the elderly woman died in the hospital, never even regaining consciousness. Both Monica and George seemed to be in a daze during the funeral and the wake. Standing by the coffin of her late mother-in-law, Monica noticed something she had never seen before. There was a large mole shaped like a heart on the late woman's left wrist. Monica had probably never noticed it before because the old woman usually wore long-sleeve dresses, which she was very fond of. When her mother-in-law passed away, Monica felt the kind of emptiness that only those who have lost family members can understand. George was also very upset by the death of his mother. who had raised him alone and given up everything so that he could grow up to be a worthy person. At some point, his wife's pregnancy seemed to fade into the background as George was overcome with grief. Despite the fact that the doctors recommended Monica be admitted to the hospital a week before her due date, the woman decided to stay home until she started having contractions. Feeling a sharp pain in her lower abdomen, Monica chose not to bother her husband and called a cab. The woman didn't really remember how she got to the hospital, throwing anxious glances at the back seat from time to time. The taxi driver was drenched in sweat as the woman kept repeating, "It hurts so bad. Can't you go any faster?" That morning, the taxi driver broke his own speed record and got the woman to the hospital in just 5 minutes. "Well, it's going to get better now. Don't worry," the driver whispered, helping Monica get out of the car. After getting the woman to the doctors, the driver leaned back against the wall of the clinic and wiped the sweat off his forehead. Despite the emotional beginning to Monica's labor, the rest went quickly and smoothly. In just half an hour, the woman gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. Holding the baby, the young woman couldn't help but tear up, thanking heaven that everything went well. But what she wanted most at that moment was to share this joy with her husband, who didn't even know that he'd become a father. Unfortunately, when the on-call nurse decided to tell George White the good news, it turned out that he didn't even want to come to the hospital to take his wife and daughter home. How is that even possible? Is he insane? I've never seen anything like this. I mean, I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime, but this is a first. The doctor who delivered Monica's baby couldn't help but comment. Monica lowered her eyes in embarrassment and sniffled quietly. She didn't want to tell the doctor that her husband only wanted a boy and that the birth of a daughter wasn't part of his life plan. Monica stayed at the hospital for 2 days, at which point the doctors and nurses finally managed to convince George to come and see his newborn daughter. Having arrived at the hospital, the businessman went into Monica's room with an indifferent expression on his face and a small bouquet of flowers. When George opened the door, the first person he saw was Monica, holding a tiny baby in her arms. "And here's our daddy," Monica exclaimed happily. George took a few steps and hesitated. The man's gaze involuntarily lingered on the baby's hand, which was squeezing her mother's girl with her tiny, wrinkled fingers. George's eyes suddenly filled with tears, which quickly began streaming down his cheeks, flushed with shame. There was a little birthmark in the shape of a heart on the baby's left hand, the same as George's late mother had. "Dear Lord, this is so surreal. Mom? Mommy?" George whispered and sank to his knees with a groan. At that moment, he couldn't have been happier with Monica, who gave him a daughter who would grow up to look like her grandmother. Like his mother? But the main surprise was waiting for George a little later when Monica let him hold his daughter for the first time and told him her name. "It's Charlotte." "Of course it's Charlotte," he said, looking lovingly at his daughter. George couldn't believe his eyes. Yesterday, he had only wanted to have a son. But now, he couldn't get enough of his daughter, who looked like a small blonde angel. Ever since then, George had repeatedly thought back to the times when he naively thought that raising a boy would be better than raising a girl. When you're truly happy in marriage, the gender of your unborn child doesn't really matter, because it is only the child's upbringing that determines who they will become in the future.